Hello everybody, this is Fiveum, here with another article for the reading list. Today's article is Texas, Land of Wealth and Fear by Theodore H White. This article was published in the magazine aptly titled The Reporter in their June 8, 1954 edition. Like previous articles, should the author be explaining something that is common sense to a 1954 reader, but is a bit more obscure to a modern reader or listener, I will use the familiar sound effect to denote the beginning and end of my explanations and or comments. I should say that this article was a bit tricky for me to record because there are a lot of little donks. Additionally, due to the, let's just say antiquated nature of the article, there are at least 2 slurs, as well as some other words that I might not be remembering off the top of my head that might have been appropriate for 1954, but would not be appropriate for modern discussion. I will not include any such words. One more oddity. For some reason, unts.org owns the copyright to the archives of the Reporter magazine. Unts.org is a website infamous for its regular hosting and promotion of Holocaust denial content. However, I do find this article to be rather important, and I think it is worth reading and discussing. Despite this, I do respect Unts' copyright, and if you're going to want to read it for yourself, you're unfortunately going to have to get it from unts.org. But without further ado, let's begin. Haroldson L. Hunt of Dallas, a tall, white-haired, green-eyed man of 65, differs radically from such other Texas political operators as Clint Murchison and Hugh Ray Cullen. We have just started the article and already our first donk. I don't know if this record will ever be beaten in future articles. Anyway, the other 2 men referenced, Murchison and Cullen, were both Texas oil barons, men who made it big in the Texas oil boom. An interesting bit of context, I like to describe the whole Texas oil boom at the time as almost similar to the modern-day trend of the somewhat stereotypical usually frat bro or just kind of college kid who, develops some sort of app or program, and he goes from like a 0 to a billionaire almost overnight. In a sense, the Texas oil barons are similar to the precursors for the new money tech bros we have today. Some of you might even be familiar with the classic sitcom The Beverly Hillbillies, which was all about this sort of thing. I expect to hear the names of a lot more Texas oil men in the near future. While Murchison and Cullen apparently persist in the old-fashioned idea that money talks loudest in politics, Hunt has discovered that there is something more important to politicians, namely the pre-packaging of public opinion to deliver votes en masse, when and as necessary. It is not that Hunt is contemptuous of the simpler uses of money in politics. Like his colleagues, he operates far beyond the boundaries of Texas, not only in his avowed financial support of such national endeavors as the MacArthur for President movement, but in individual state campaigns such as those in Maryland, where he donated $3,000 to Glenn Beall in 1952, in Montana, in which he donated $3,000 for Zales Ecton same year, and in West Virginia, where he donated $2,950 to Chapman Rivercombe. All right, let's start from the beginning. So the MacArthur for President endeavor was an attempt by fans of General Douglas MacArthur to draft him to run for president. General Douglas MacArthur was a World War II era hero who most famously held the title of Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, at least within Japan and the Eastern Front during World War II. He was also an avowed anti-communist, and in my opinion, he took things a bit too far at times. In fact, In 1932, in the height of the Great Depression, there were a group of destitute World War I veterans who were promised by Congress a bonus for serving in the military that was supposed to come to them any time between the years of 1935 and 1945. Being the Great Depression, they really wanted that money now, so in 1932 they protested outside the White House for it. General Douglas MacArthur was, for some reason, absolutely convinced that communists had overtaken that protest and used tanks to break up the literally peacefully protesting veterans. This humiliation resulted in him being transferred over to the Philippines, which at the time was a U.S. territory. Coincidentally, him being there was, in a sense, what propelled him to the modern-day fame of being the general who, well, led American forces in World War II in the Pacific Theater. He was, of course, put in charge of American forces during the Korean War, when he infamously asked Harry Truman for 50-something or 40-something nuclear bombs, with which he wanted to quite literally just nuke the entire Korean peninsula in an attempt to dissuade any sort of communist agitation or rebellion. Then U.S. President Harry Truman was so appalled by this that he relieved MacArthur of his duties. Despite asking for 50 or 40-something nukes, he was, well, let's just say his immense anti-communism gained him a certain fan base in the USA who wanted him to run for president. From what I could figure out, he was never interested in any such position. As for the other three, they were all Republican Party candidates in their respective states, each one eventually serving one term in the Senate, save for Chapman Rivercombe, who only served half a term, as he was elected in a special election, as the senator before him, William Laird III, resigned after about 8 months. I really don't know why he resigned after 8 months. It does say that he was appointed by the governor to fill a vacancy when the senator even before him died, but I'm getting off track. Let's just get back to the article. All three of these guys were in the Republican Party. As for what they stood for, well, as the article goes on, you'll see what Mr. Hunt's personal interests are. And these, of course, like most such public listings, probably represent only a portion of his out-of-state political commitments. Texans believe he is also deeply involved in the 1950 campaign of Richard Nixon against Helen Gagan Douglas in California, and that of Frank A. Barrett against Joseph C. O'Mahony in Wyoming in 1952. The Richard Nixon one is probably the more notable one, in which Richard Nixon successfully unseated Mrs. Gates in a rather tense senatorial election. The lesser-known one is the Wyoming case of Frank Barrett versus Joseph C. O'Mahony. It's a bit of an odd case because O'Mahony was a member of the Democratic Party and the incumbent. He lost narrowly, but then ran again the following year when the other Senate seat was open and won. Mahoney was an avid Roosevelt Democrat and a staunch supporter of the New Deal, which is likely the reason that Mr. Hunt did not like him. Such direct operations are, however, vastly overshadowed by the political power Hunt has packed into the family of radio and TV shows associated with Facts Forum, the non-profit foundation he supports. Seen at first hand, the headquarters of Facts Forum, located on the 7th floor of Dallas's Mercantile Securities Building, close enough to Hunt's own offices in another building to receive personal attention, is not at all imposing. The door is marked only, Facts Forum dispels apathy. Behind are no flossy receptionists, anterooms, or appurtenances of power, such as adorn Madison Avenue enterprises of 1/10 the influence. Instead, one finds a cheery, disorganized series of rooms with books, pamphlets, and magazines stacked helter-skelter on tables, shelves, and cabinets. The air of bustling optimism is well justified, for Hunt's fascination with the mechanics and engineering of public opinion seems to grow each month as he completes the transition from his fantastically profitable past to the self-given role of elder statesman. Over this past, as over Hunt's future, rests a cloud of speculation and uncertainty. The first record of his name in Dallas was a casual social note in the Dallas Morning News for January 16, 1938, announcing that, quote, "Quite the nicest family imaginable has come to Mount Vernon of Dallas to stay," end quote. And going on to report that Mr. H. L. Hunt with a wife, 4 sons, and 2 daughters had just arrived from Tyler, Texas to purchase an oversized replica of Mount Vernon in Dallas's most fashionable suburb. To this day, Dallasites know little more for certain about the tight-lipped, mysterious Hunt than what he has vouchsafed on occasional interviews: that he was born in Vandalia, Illinois, stayed in school long enough to acquire a 5th-grade education, was a wandering ranch-hand and lumberjack before settling down on a farm in Arkansas in 1911, entered the oil business around 1920, and in 1931 won his first big stake in the East Texas pool. About these bare facts, however, there swirls gossip so persistent as to be impossible to ignore. Sometime between the acquisition of his farm in 1911 and his entry into the oil business, H. L. Hunt acquired a reputation as a professional gambler, known up and down the Mississippi. His first major oil leases were acquired, according to legend, in a poker game. We know in modern times that this legend actually is true. He did acquire some of his first oil leases in a poker game. At the time of this article was published, it was just a rumor, though. The late 1920s found him a minor and inconspicuous oil operator in Arkansas and Texas with no great finds to his credit until the East Texas pool came out in 1930. No one to this day knows precisely how Hunt got Dad Joyner's original field away from him. The men who operated in East Texas in those days consider it one of the sharpest bits of business in an industry known for slick dealing. Dad Joyner went on to die broke, commemorated only in the name of the town of Joynerville, Texas, and H. L. Hunt went to acquire one of the greatest fortunes in modern times. During the new and fair deal days, Hunt stretched his empire through Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. Today, with an estimated 300 million barrels of oil reserves, he is bracketed with Sid Richardson as a candidate for billionaire rank. Sid Richardson was another contemporary Texas oil man. While the exact scope of Hunt's fortune might not have been known at the time of writing this, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure exactly how to calculate it now. From what I could figure out, it would be fair to say that at this point in time, Hunt was the first or second richest living man in America and probably the world. The growth of his fortune to such dimensions seemed unable to still his persistent gambling instinct. From Tyler, he bet on horses around the country and frequently dashed off to Florida to follow the races for months at a time when any winnings must have been made grotesquely unimportant by his oil wealth. Indeed, Hunt's unquestionable delight in the ways of chance persists. It was only last year at a dinner party in Dallas that he pulled out several lists of football games around the country which he had been doping out and offered to bet against anyone at the table on 3 out of 5 contests. The odds, someone noted, were stacked 3-2 in favor of the House being one of the half-dozen richest men in the world. Helping out the House odds. To American politics, Hunt seems to have brought the same desire to underwrite his simpler gambles in individual campaigns by newer techniques for improving the House odds. In Fax Forum, he has found a way of doing so. The namesake radio program, Fax Forum, began in 1951, and it can now be heard on 246 stations from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. The Fax Forum organization sponsors Answers for Americans, carried free on 139 ABC radio and 13 TV stations across the nation. To these have been added a TV version of Fax Forum, carried by 67 stations, a companion show, State of the Nation, free time on 131 MBS stations, and this spring the nationwide Reporters Roundup acquired from MBS, with free airtime on 216 stations. Facts Forum seems to reflect only a part of Mr. Hunt's ambitions in progress to eminence as a manipulator of opinion. Last year, Hunt won an FCC license to operate a commercial TV station in Corpus Christi. Twice this year he has visited New York, held press conferences, and scanned the nation's word capital in search of opportunities. He has tried to acquire control of Collier's and Coronet, and has been rebuffed in both cases. He was spurned by NBC this April in his attempt to wring free time from the network for another Facts Forum nationwide show. Currently, gossip in the word business holds that the undaunted Mr. Hunt is readying a national news magazine for fall publication. Meanwhile, through Facts Forum, Hunt commands a national grassroots organization whose influence almost every Washington senator has felt in the push behind the Bricker Amendment, and whose power any small-town Texas editor can explain by pointing to the flood of Facts Forum-inspired letters supporting Senator McCarthy. If any of you have listened to my reading of the Pseudo-Conservative Revolt, you might recall that the Bricker Amendment was a proposed constitutional amendment that would effectively limit the authority of the executive branch of government, aka the president, regarding foreign treaties and making deals with foreign powers. It was a bit of a remnant of the old school days of American isolationism. As for McCarthy, you may be familiar with the infamous anti-communist demagogue Joe McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, who would, for all intents and purposes, accuse anyone of being communist because, I don't know, made him famous, so I guess I'll give him that. Around this point in time, 1954, McCarthy and McCarthyism was kind of on its last legs, hence the reference to many letters supporting Joe McCarthy, who at this point in time was in the process of officially being censured by the Senate. According to the U.S. Senate website, the official vote for and final confirmation of the censure happened in December of 1954. There is a final thing that should be said about Hunt and Facts Forum. They did not create the climate of opinion that they now foster. The ideas they push are the common currency of the men who shape Texas thinking and run Texas politics. Hunt may not have developed these ideas into a system of politics, but he has brought his remarkable gifts for business organization to exporting them across the country as he exports oil and gas. He does it cheaply, too, with $3 million worth of free airtime wrung out of the big radio networks. Hunt may be serious when he estimates his annual outlay on Facts Forum at only $20,000. America has so long been bombarded with concepts, prejudices, and symbols that have been loaded and aimed from emplacements in New York, Washington, and Hollywood that it has difficulty recognizing Dallas, Texas as a contender in this field. This is unfortunate because the voices of Facts Forum are recurrent Native American voices tracing their descent from the know-nothings of yesterday. The Native American Party, more commonly referred to as the Know-Nothings, were a political party from the mid-1800s. Their biggest and most famous or infamous concern was the concern of immigration. They called themselves the Native American Party not by our modern concept of a Native American, but to say rather that they were born in the USA rather than foreigners who immigrated here. While I can't speak for the general authority or power that they managed to have over American politics, I do know that they dominated some local races, and in the presidential election of 1856, they actually won the state of Maryland. These ideas have persisted in the fluid, ever-changing life of America almost as tenaciously as the ideals of American freedom and tolerance. But they have always hitherto been minority voices. What happens when they gain the upper hand in a community is nowhere better demonstrated than in Texas itself, whose governor, Allen Shivers, is a member of the advisory board of Facts Forum and governs the state by the code that he shares with it. Politics by the quote-unquote proper people. On the surface, Texas politics has a breezy, wide-open appearance. Texans like to boast that their state has no machine and politics is a free-for-all. What they mean by this disclaimer is simply that nobody has ever defined the kind of machine that runs their state. It is true that they have no machine in the recognizable Eastern form of patronage, spoils, and block-delivered votes. While there's a lot of details I'm going to be ignoring for the sake of just explaining this simply, the general rule of thumb for this sort of thing was you had a political boss who may or may not have been elected. During election time, said political boss would have his cronies shepherd people to the polls to vote for that boss's preferred ticket. The boss would then reward his cronies with, usually government jobs or sometimes government contracts, usually at the local or state level. And likewise, the boss would also make sure that the commoners who voted for him got something that would keep them happy. This, of course, was ripe for corruption, as you basically needed the boss's permission to get anything done in politics. For the sake of fairness, I should say that a political machine is not necessarily corrupt. In my opinion, I'd say that a political machine is more of just one giant get-out-the-vote machine. However, they do have a long history of being corrupt. From what I could figure out so far, the only, old-school political machine that is still functioning would be the Cook County, Illinois Democratic Party machine. There is, in a sense, also the Queens County Democratic Party, but that machine, from what I could figure out, is fighting for its life. Texas politics rests instead on a series of autonomous, self-winding groups in each community consisting of the local aristocracy of enterprise and commercial achievement. These close-knit social groups are the respectable people: merchants, lawyers, bankers, publishers, contractors, businessmen, oilmen, and their wives, who run their cities as if the cities were clubs in which they constituted the nominating committees, and the electorate at large the herd. Some of these little oligarchies, as in San Antonio, may at times be as corrupt and crude as Frank Hague's old Camarilla in Jersey City. Others, as in Dallas, may be distinguished by the most extraordinary civic responsibility and honesty. But their common characteristic is a ruthlessness that arrogates them the sole control of local political life. The men who direct community affairs are not the big rich, but the little rich. The big rich are far more interested in national politics with its ever-present threat to their tax privileges. The little rich, swept by their emotions of fear and insecurity, see in every school board contest, in every independent candidate who repudiates their leadership, the hand of Moscow or the CIO bent on destroying Texas institutions. Prior to merging with the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL for short, the CIO, or Congress of Industrial Organizations, was a collection of labor unions. Not too long after this article was written, believe it or not, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations merged to become the AFL-CIO, which is still in operation to this day. The CIO at the time had a reputation for being the more aggressive and radical of the two competing labor organizations, and while they officially did have an anti-communist stance, the actual enforcement of their anti-communist statements would depend on the individual unions themselves. Of course, as this article points out, anything is communist if you get in the right mindset, I guess. The number one shivercat. Upon this loose federation of businessmen's machines rests the power of the present dominant figure of Texas politics, Governor Allen Shivers, a tall, dark man of extraordinary ability and vindictiveness. A lawyer born poor, Shivers entered politics at 27 from the highly industrialized Port Arthur area, voted pro-labor consistently during his early years in the Texas Senate, and then went on to sponsor the so-called Millionaire's Amendment to limit the federal income tax to a maximum of 25%. Succeeding to the governorship by death of the incumbent in 1949, Shivers, by the end of his present term, and he is seeking another, will have governed Texas longer than any other man in its history. An intimate of the big rich, Allen Shivers is friendly with both Cullen and Hunt, whose contacts with the oil companies are excellent. Humble Oil occasionally puts its executive plane, the Flying Jenny, at his disposal for his flights about the state. Shivers nevertheless represents a force basically independent of both the big rich and the big oil companies. Made substantially wealthy by his wife's orchard and cattle properties at the Mexican border, among the more consistent employers of W. labor in the area, Shivers' instinct of government, is the generalized instinct of all the men and community groups who form his political base. Like Thomas E. Dewey, with whom he has been compared, Shivers is an excellent technician at every level of politics. He is slick enough to import high-powered professional talent to help him with radio and TV appearances, has been in control long enough to have filled all of the 116 appointive boards and commissions of Texas with nominees from every stratum of his statewide support, and is adept enough to have swung Texas to the Republicans in 1952 on the Tidelands issue, and now to prepare for a breach with Republicans over both the Benson Farm Program and President Eisenhower's opposition to the Brooker Amendment. Unlike Dewey, Shivers does not pretend to a philosophy of growth and development or to an understanding of the greater outer world and its problems. While Dewey has flatly opposed outlawing the Communist Party, Shivers, tackling the problem with a sheriff's posse, has advocated the death penalty for communists. New law west of the Pecos. Perhaps no facet of Shivers' government in Texas is more illuminating than that fear of Texas labor, which climaxed this March in the anti-subversion bills before the Texas legislature. Organized Texas labor has long constituted both the most conservative and most cowed bodies of unions in the country. AFL and CIO together count no more than 400,000 members out of 2,651,000 non-agricultural workers on the state's payrolls. As manufacturing has soared 9 times in value in 15 years, industrial labor has grown from 163,978 in 1939 to 464,105 in 1953. And as labor has grown, laws have been fashioned in the state to hobble it. Starting in 1941, the Texas legislature has piled law on law until by now every form of union security, closed shop, union shop, maintenance of membership, is outlawed. Unions are subject to all commercial antitrust legislation. Picketing is unlawful if there are more than 2 pickets every 50 feet. Union officials and organizers must be registered with the state and carry identity cards. All unions must file complete financial reports with the state, thus exposing their strength and resources. No felon can be a union official, and Texas laws permit the branding of a quote-unquote felon of any union man who gets into a brawl on a picket line. It should be noted, too, that such laws have far more than statewide impact. No less than half a dozen other states in the region have followed Texas's lead, remodeling their laws either precisely or approximately on its labor code. For a bit of reference, a closed shop is a workplace in which the union can decide who is hired or fired, or an employee must be hired through the union or at least with the union's permission. A union shop is when everyone who is hired must join the union or be a member of the union as a prerequisite for employment, the main difference between a union shop and a closed shop being that in a union shop the employer is still free to hire whomever they want, and maintenance of membership is what the modern-day quote-unquote right-to-work laws are about. With maintenance of membership, you are not required to join a union, but you are still required to pay union dues on the grounds that the union contract still impacts you. Additionally, even in these types of shop settings, if you are not a member of a union, you are allowed to ask the union for assistance, and the union is legally obligated to represent you to the best of its ability. Well, to a certain extent. For more information, look up the duty of fair representation or the right to fair representation. You can probably find some on labor law websites or something. To cap these laws, Texas this spring passed a new set of loyalty and subversion acts. These make quote-unquote communism, which is never precisely defined, a felony punishable by from 2 to 20 years in jail. They establish penalties for quote-unquote subversives, also undefined, that permit stripping these unfortunates of any privileges of citizenship and enjoying their exercise of any business or profession licensed by the state. Under the new laws, upon the affidavit of one quote-unquote credible witness and the application of a district attorney, a local judge may order the search of any establishment and the seizure of quote-unquote books, records, pamphlets, cards, recordings, receipts, lists, memos, pictures, or any written instrument, end quote. If the establishment to be raided is a private home, the affidavit must come from two quote-unquote credible witnesses. One episode during the hearing on these bills is as revealing of the atmosphere in which they were passed as any disquisition. Surprised and upset by the large crowd at a hearing, Representative Bill Daniel, a brother of U.S. Senator Price Daniel, rose suddenly and demanded, "Is there a communist in the room?" He glared about him, then snapped, "You've all got your coats on. How do I know you're not carrying guns?" Representative Daniel had a coat on himself. He was finally pacified only when the chairman ordered a paper passed around the room to newsmen and spectators, ordering all to write their names and addresses for security purposes. In their present form, these bills represent a negative triumph for labor and other groups that oppose them. One of the bills originally specified the death penalty for communism, and the bill's sponsor, Representative Robert Patton, refused any whittling down of the death sentence. He wouldn't even accept life imprisonment as a substitute, he said, because he didn't want those communists hanging around the penitentiary to corrupt Texas prisoners. Likewise defeated was the original proposal for a state loyalty review board, an administrative tribunal that might, without judicial process, have declared any man disloyal and thus deprived him of all rights of citizenship down to his hunting, fishing, and driving licenses. New Code of the Southwest. Such acts and such legislative leadership would be easier to press into the more familiar patterns of American state politics if they did spring from the calculations of a smooth-running party machine. They spring, however, from no blueprint, but only from what has been called the anarchy of the radical right, the distemper of spirit that Texans share with a still unmeasured percentage of American citizens. This distemper is nationwide, and its symptoms are familiar. The belief that labor unions and foreigners are dangerous, that the New Deal was not a debatable episode in American history, but a conspiracy of aliens, that our allies are blood-sucking America into bankruptcy, that the American government is honeycombed with spies, that the United Nations is a compact with the devil written and conceived by Alger Hiss on orders from Moscow, that UNESCO is its changeling child, is an institution preaching free love, racial misogynation, and death to American traditions, that Joe McCarthy is the senior patriot of the nation, and that both older American parties are legitimate objects of deep suspicion. Well, that was fun to read. For anyone who needs a refresher, Alger Hiss was a high-ranking State Department official who was busted selling state secrets to the Soviet Union. While McCarthy accused just about everybody of communism, the fact that somebody so high up actually was busted selling state secrets to the Soviet Union was generally used as evidence that there had to be more, or that any of the McCarthyist witch hunts had some sort of merit to them. Truth be told, if you just accuse everyone of being a communist, you're going to get it right sometimes. Also, I'm not really sure why they harp on UNESCO in particular. This set of convictions is the code of what has become an unrecognized third party in American politics. The leadership of this party has, to be sure, long been familiar nationally in the roster of Solons that start with McCarthy, Jenner, McCarran, and Velde in Washington, and ends with such purely regional luminaries as Jack Tenney in Southern California. Yeah, as for all those names, they were basically avid supporters of McCarthy and McCarthyism and immense anti-communism. In fact, McCarran was actually the leader of the House Un-American Activities Committee. In fact, its birth has been heralded by such seers as Colonel Robert R. McCormick of Chicago, whose Tribune is presently hailing its boss's latest efforts to make out of such men a For America political pressure group to contend with the older parties. Its antecedents run back through Rankin and Bilbo to the Klan and to even remoter origins. Bilbo is referring to Senator Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi, who was extremely racist, like I'd say even for his time. One of his more infamous moments was when he aggressively filibustered anti-lynching legislation. I actually remember reading it a while ago. In his filibuster, he talked something about how, anti-lynching laws would open the gates of hell, or, metaphorically speaking, or something like that. Rankin was a bit trickier. There's a lot of people throughout the history of Congress with the name Rankin. but it's likely he's referring to Representative John Rankin of Mississippi, who was also extremely racist, perhaps the most infamous story of his being when, in World War II, a U.S. Navy ship exploded. Congress authorized a $5,000 payout to the families of the deceased. Rankin realized that the majority of those families would be black, so he demanded that the $5,000 payout be reduced to $3,000. Honestly, I'll be honest, I could literally spend all day going on about the sheer racism of those two guys, but I'm just gonna have to say, look it up for yourselves, because holy heck do they go all out. What makes this third party generally difficult to recognize is the fact that it is so far not an organization, but a state of mind. This state of mind flourishes either quietly or exuberantly in almost every part of the United States, with special vigor in Southern California, another newly developed area of numberless uprooted. In the Tribune's Chicagoland and certain strata of Detroit, New York, and Boston life, but it is only in Texas that this state of mind has crystallized so completely that the third party has reached the status of a governing force. Texas elects to the National Congress such distinguished men as Sam Rayburn and Wright Patman, but they come from rural districts rather than from big cities. The two men named were representatives in the House of Representatives from the state of Texas who had relatively distinguished political careers. In fact, not too long after this article was written, Sam Rayburn would become the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Likewise, Sam Rayburn is one of the few Southern politicians who refused to sign the Southern Manifesto, which was a document that just about every notable Southern politician signed to protest the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. They are a small minority of Texas's congressional delegation. The great majority of Texas congressmen, like the government of their state, speak not for the Democratic Party whose label they bear, but for what Governor Shivers calls the Texas Democratic Party. When Governor Shivers nominates Senator McCarthy, as he did last year, as an honorary Texan citizen, he merely dots the I's and crosses the T's, improving the affiliation of the Texas Democratic Party with a nationwide group, namely the Third Party. Slice of paradise. One travels through the beautiful suburbs of Texas cities, the clean new houses where children play on the green lawns, the innocent voices laughing in the evening, the dogs frisking. One reads in the newspapers of meetings of parent-teachers associations, of dads clubs, of citizens' councils, of flower clubs. To a traveler returned from years in Europe, this seems a slice of paradise where no evil could lurk. The traveler learns differently. San Antonio was considered the most tolerant and easygoing of Texas cities, yet this was where the Minutewomen put the Catholic Archbishop under surveillance because he had been heard saying that he was going to vote for Adlai Stevenson. In Houston, largest of Texas cities, the Central Council of the American Legion has set up a local patrol committee, quote, to watch for any subversive groups or organizations which might come to Houston to hold meetings under the auspices of churches, schools, or other organizations, end quote. Houston is where Legionnaires brawled with Quakers in an attempt to break up a Friends Service Committee meeting because it looked quote-unquote subversive. Okay, I just got to comment on this. While the Friends Service Committee is, they could appear pretty left-leaning, Quakers are literally religious pacifists, and honestly, I'm just going to say, in my opinion, you got to be a real piece of shit to get into a brawl with a Quaker. That's all I'm going to say about it. Houston is the city where a slate of school board candidates running solely on an anti-UNESCO plank filled 2 of 4 contested seats. Houston is the city where the university decided not to give broadcast lectures on American history this year for fear that the subject matter would be called controversial. You know, I'm recording this in 2021, and on the eve of 2022, I guess, but reading this stuff is like, man, some things never change, eh? Nowadays, it's all about the critical race theory and, I don't know, some sort of Marxist ideology trying to poison schools, or, whatever, I guess. Dallas is Texas's self-proclaimed capital of culture. Yet some of the ladies there have learned how to use the telephone to hound neighbors for supposed subversion, or to call the FBI when they dislike someone, as happened to a widow in a Dallas suburb who told me her story. It was 7 in the evening when the bell rang in the little white frame house where she lives alone. A clean-shaven young man showed her his credentials and told her he was from the FBI. He had received reports, he said, that she was in correspondence with people abroad. She explained that she had read a recent travel book on Yugoslavia and had written out to one of the women mentioned in it, and had been answered. All this, she said, had happened since Tito became our ally. Here in this box were all the letters. Would the FBI man like to read them? No, he didn't want to read them. But had she ever written about China? No, she hadn't, she said. And the FBI man said not to worry and went on his way. Emily and the enemy. Such gossip can reach up to imperil even the most distinguished and conservative. Only this spring, Dallas witnessed one of the most curious attempted character assassinations ever to occur in Texas. In 1951, a Cleveland industrialist transplant to Texas named Neil Malone organized a Dallas Council of World Affairs, despite the fact that its roster of speakers included, among others, former Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. It aroused suspicion. One of Dallas's moderately wealthy citizens set himself up to investigate the council, and it was not long before he hit pay dirt. The executive director of the council, an attractive young man named Glenn Costin, was traced to a meeting at a hotel in Cleveland last January that had been sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association Incorporated of New York. Here, it was ascertained, had become Emily, President Emeritus of the Foreign Policy Association. Honestly, I was a bit confused by the whole Foreign Policy Association thing. I did some looking around, and it looks like not even much of a political think tank as much as it's a culture club dedicated to trying to help Americans learn more about the rest of the world. I mean, maybe there is some political stuff. I guess they try to get some sort of government grants or something, or maybe try to influence school curriculums to be more inclusive of the rest of the world, I guess. But I seriously am having a hard time trying to pin down how this could remotely be communist, but well, the third party doesn't have to make that much sense. Now, Brooks Emeny had once been on the board of directors of the Institute of Pacific Relations, and so had Alger Hiss. QED from Alger Hiss to Brooks Emeny to the Foreign Policy Association to a Cleveland meeting of the Foreign Policy Association to the Dallas Council on World Affairs to its executive secretary to Neil Malone, a clear red trail was drawn. Furthermore, whispered the gossips with no proof, Malone was selling industrial equipment to Russia, which he was not. Now all this may sound too preposterous to believe, yet for one full month while this correspondent was in Texas, the Dallas Council on World Affairs fought for its life. And only because on its board sit honorary members from the city's largest banks and most respected businesses could it get a fair hearing from the citizenry and be cleared, after declaring its formal disaffiliation and disassociation from and any lack of connection with the Foreign Policy Association, of which Secretary of State John Foster Dulles is a member. The Perils of Growth. If this climate has developed in Texas to such a uniquely morbid degree, the reasons are not too hard to discern. The dominant factor is, of course, the peril that Texans share with all Americans in a country locked permanently in a struggle with the forces of communism around the world. And in Texas, nerves have cracked generally worse than elsewhere in the United States, because to the emotions of that struggle have been added all the other strains which that state is experiencing. For it is an enormous strain on human minds and long-cherished traditions to change as swiftly as Texas has changed. Texas is a state where only a generation ago cotton was king, and of 16 million acres once in cotton, only 6 million are still sown to the fiber. Odessa, a far west village of 500 persons in 1930, today counts 45,000. Houston, a city of 250,000 in 1930, today counts 750,000, boasting that in each year but the one since the end of the war, it has led the nation's cities in construction and capital investment. Dallas 30 years ago was a drowsy cotton trading and wholesaling center. Today it is the Southwest's financial capital, with 2 of the nation's top 25 banks boasting the establishment of more new insurance companies last year than any other city in the country. Each month, the recorded influx to Dallas comes to 1,700 job seekers without counting their families and those who arrive without being recorded. At the mercy of the more modern forms of communication, these new Texans find, with one or two magnificent exceptions, all the papers and radio and television stations drumming at them with incitement to be afraid and to conform. Not quite sure of themselves, they fall silent or get in step. Conformity in Texas finds ready-made clothes, the flashiest of which is the incredibly exaggerated form of local patriotism called Texanism. Texanism is different from the pride of a Bostonian in Boston or a Californian in California. It is a form of nationalism that began more or less as a joke, as a simple braggadocio about the biggest state with the prettiest girls and the fightingest men in the Union, and is ended by making Texans literally believe that there is a difference politically between their state and the other states, and that the Union is always a political menace to Texas rights and privileges. Though it is untrue, as one northern mother claimed, that Texas children are taught more Texas history than American history, it is true that Texas, its legends, its history, and its heroes is taught to its children with far greater intensity than a Boston child is taught of the Battle of Bunker Hill, or an Illinois child of the settling of the prairies on which he lives. In adult life, this provincial nationalism can be capitalized on by either such state politicians as the one who boasted, "I am a Southerner before I am an American, and a Texan before I am a Southerner," or by industries such as the assembly plant at Dallas that advertises its cars as made in Texas, by Texans, for Texans. Texanism is a synthetic faith that lets them oppose all the controls and exactions of the federal government in Washington as an invasion of sacred and immemorial rights, while at the same time providing with its frontier and vigilante memories a complete answer to the newer problems of minorities, labor, and the complexities of city living. Frequently, it should be noted, Texanism is the strongest and most vocal among those who have arrived in Texas from out of state, while those who prefer to be Americans first and Texas second are frequently descended from the oldest and most distinguished families in Texas history. These elements, the common national struggle, the unsettling effect of rapid change, the myth of Texanism, are in themselves almost enough to explain why Texas politics has taken on such a peculiar cast. But when all these elements are manipulated by clever men, and by the kind of money that the little rich, the prosperous car dealers, the contractors, the bottling concessionaires, the little oilmen, the real estate men, can make available to state candidates of their choice, these emotions can be made to stand up and march. Practical politics, with the last S being a $sign. Practical Texas politics, the mechanics of electioneering starts with the truths that first, more money is needed vote for vote to win a hard-fought campaign there than in any other state of the Union. And second, that the almost complete communications blackout in press, radio, and television deprives a shoestring candidate for statewide office of any chance of making his voice heard above the blatant and blare of phony emotions. $250,000 is the minimum estimate for any easy statewide campaign, $1 million for a hard-fought one. The shoestring candidate must travel to make himself heard until his voice is hoarse, and traveling in the vast distances of Texas with 2 sound trucks is expensive. Direct mail is more expensive. $96,000 for a single mailing to each registered voter in the state. An adept like Alan Shivers, well-heeled himself, and even more candidates lavishly supported by little businessmen across the state, can scientifically survey, cross-check, and resurvey public opinion moods. Salesmen and districtmen of large statewide firms will go from gas station to gas station along their routes of call-spreading gossip. This man in Yarborough, Shivers' opponent in 1952, and again this year, is a nice guy, one rumor-mongering campaign ran. He speaks nice too, but I don't hold with his idea of mixing N kids with white kids in school. In the game of Texas politics, the trick is always to tag the other fellow as red, left-wing, or the tool of the CIO and the power-hungry political bosses of the North. I feel obligated to point out that what I read was not me trying to do an accent, but quite literally it was phonetically spelled that way. I will say, looking at the modern-day red baiting, well, some things never change, do they? This is a technique that can be readily applied to anybody by such masters of public relations as John Van Cronkite, Associates of Austin, and Watson Associates of Dallas. Watson Associates was slick enough to even brand Homer Rainey, the distinguished former president of the University of Texas, an atheist in his campaign for governor in 1946. Trapped by a planted question during his campaign, Rainey said that he would have to consider the circumstances before firing out of hand any hypothetical atheist who might be discovered on the campus. His answer, rebroadcast around the state, was converted to a charge of atheism against Rainey himself, and the man was crushed. The classic assembly of all these elements was best executed in the Texas campaign of '52, a political orgy on which the neat statistics of votes throw little light. Actually, the Democrats, with 970,000 odd votes, pushed the Republicans, who got 1,102,000 votes, hard. It was not money alone that wrenched Texas out of the Democratic column for the second time in 8 years, lifting the Republican score from its 1948 total of 282,000 to 4 times that, even though the Eisenhower-Shivers campaign used an estimated 6 million and the Stevenson forces raised only 180,000. The critical factor in the Texas campaign was pressure, the power of community leadership, to make a vote for Stevenson not only unpatriotic but un-Texan and downright dangerous. Eisenhower was Texas-born to begin with, and the billboard screamed, "Vote Texan, vote Ike!" One night, a group of residents of one of Dallas's better suburbs hired a sound truck that circled around the home of one Stevensonian, blaring, "H.R. Aldridge, are you a Texan? H.R. Aldridge, are you going to vote for Ike? H.R. Aldridge, how are you going to vote?" Across the state, the campaign took on the hue of a carnival and religious revival. "I spent $15,000, said one lady ranch owner with oil royalties. "But it was such fun. We had 2 cowboy bands and girls dressed up as cowgirls, and we went up and down the county for Eisenhower with those bands. Where cowboy bands and cowgirls did not work, there was social pressure at the country club, in the office, in business, through the banks, of 100 loyal and fairly well-known Democrats who were requested by the DNC to sign their names to a Stevenson appeal. Only 15 dared to do so, licked before he even started. Even so powerful a man as Senator Tom Connally did not dare offer his name in the Senate primary race. Burning oil on troubled waters. The Tidelands oil issue, of course, dominated the Texas campaign of 1952, and no better illustration could be offered of the dovetailing of special interest with burning emotion. The economics of the Tidelands issue was relatively simple. If offshore oil was to be developed under federal jurisdiction, the federal government could require payment by producers of a royalty of 37.5% as it does on oil discovered on other public lands. If offshore oil was to be developed under Texas jurisdiction, producers would be required to pay only 12.5% as on most Texas state lands. For the oilmen, it was preferable that the tidelands be controlled by the state rather than by federal government authority. But this was not a very exciting issue to debate before voters. It was obviously better to dress the issue in Texan patriotism and emotion. That was easy, because royalties from Texas state lands go to support the public schools, and the children of Texas could be described as the true victims of federal control. This could be done and was done by Watson Associates in a campaign newspaper financed by Clint Murchison, which showed a beaked and evil Stevenson sneering at a classroom of Texas children saying, "Tideland funds for those kids? Oh, let them pick cotton." Or it could be done by imported Hollywood film and TV technicians who ran off documentaries on the Tidelands to be shown over and over again in the last few weeks of campaigning, until, as one baffled parent put it, "My kids came running in from the TV set like Paul Revere, tears streaming down from their eyes, saying, 'Pa, they're trying to take our Tidelands away.'" The tide after Tidelands. As the passions of the 1952 campaign have ebbed, many of the mingled elements have untangled themselves, and Texas politics now presents a relatively simple pattern. There is, first, a small and respectable Eisenhower branch of the Republican Party, strong chiefly in Houston, and among expatriate Northerners generally. There is next a much larger Loyalist or Stevenson Democratic base in the state. And finally there is the third party, which controls the machinery of both Republican and Democratic parties in Texas. the Republican and Democratic state chairman, were law partners in the same Dallas office until last month when the Democratic chairman resigned to run for Congress, and whose vigor stems not so much from cold, planned organization as on the crystallization of a mood into a system of politics. Texans who recognize the power of this third party like to outline it against the past of Texas's turbulent political history. Enormous gusts of emotion have swept through Texas politics again and again to reach a peak and then fade out. Texas was split down the middle, feuding over Joe Bailey 50 years ago. It was split again in bitterness and emotion over Pa and Ma Ferguson and the Klan in the mid-1920s. Ma and Pa Ferguson were a married couple who were populist governors of Texas. Quite literally, both of them were, at different points. From what I recall, Ma Ferguson was actually the first female governor in American history. Despite their relative popularity, they were also known for their infamous corruption. Likewise, Joe Bailey was a bit of a hardcore conservative Texan who opposed things like women's rights to vote and child labor laws and whatnot. And he also had a lot of issues of personal corruption and, old school aristocratic stuff, I guess. Texas democracy survived each of these emotional toots and in between went on to elect great governors, create the best school system of the South, tackle the race problem with greater tolerance than any other southern state, and write some of the soundest laws on natural resource conservation in the Union. Texas has been off on another of its emotional toots in the past 3 years, an emotional toot not quite so sharply defined as that over the KKK, not so easily recognized as was the symbolism of the white nightgown and hooded face, yet fundamentally part of the same tradition. Just how deep this emotional toot goes, how accurately the shrieking, frightened vocal community leadership represents the millions and millions of politically silent Texans, no one can tell. Perhaps the oddest contrast to the attitudes of the dominant community aristocracies is revealed in several private surveys recently conducted by pollsters in Texas. These show that cross-section for cross-section, weighing the big and little, loud and silent, Texas attitudes are only slightly more extreme on questions of communism and domestic politics. And Texas attitudes are slightly more liberal in matters of racial tolerance and respect for civil liberties than those of the nation as a whole. Currently, Texans who make a study of such things seem to feel that sometime between the campaign of '52 and the passage of the Subversion Acts in Austin this spring, the influence of the third party may have leveled off and even be abating. Any number of recent events are offered as omens. Senator McCarthy's quarrel with the Army seems to have reduced the Wisconsin senator momentarily to something a lot less than infallibility in the press, for the Army is one of the few federal institutions that Texans recognize as both patriotic and American. Moreover, it should be noted that the Army, with its numerous posts and installations, is one of Texas's largest cash crops, and even Governor Shivers found it convenient to have an appointment elsewhere when Senator McCarthy spoke, on San Jacinto Day in Houston. The determined fight of the labor unions against the establishment of a Star Chamber Loyalty Review Board resulted in victory at Austin. The collapse of cattle prices and the distresses on the farm have sweetened the memory of the federal government, whose one-time lavishness with farm aid now strikes many Texans as quite American again. In this rural discontent with the Benson Farm Program, the chief sufferer politically seems to be Alan Shivers, who is blamed in the countryside for throwing Texas to the Republicans and is hurt in the cities among the former country dwellers who still get letters from folks on the farm. There is growing resistance to the third party among both Democrats and Republicans. Among Republicans, leadership is coming from the Houston Post, owned and controlled by Secretary of Health and Welfare Ovida Culp-Hobby, which in the past 2 years has not only provided the most courageous and tolerant reporting in all of Texas, but has also gained circulation in the process, overtaking and pulling abreast of the stodgy Houston Chronicle. Yet if the Houston Post reflects the Eisenhower policy, it does not reflect the realities of Republican congressional politics. During roll call votes, Republican political strategists today count on at least 16 out of 22 nominally Democratic Texas congressmen. They can have these votes without asking and without patronage. To challenge these men and to challenge Shivers throughout the state with candidates of their own, the Republicans consider that unthinkable. Even the Houston Post will support Shivers in this year's campaign. Democratic rumblings. The true contest with Shivers lies therefore in the Democratic Party. The Democratic National Committee has now authorized the first organization to oppose the present dominant state machine. This organization, just established this spring, is called the Texas Advisory Council to the Democratic National Committee. Its purpose is twofold: to tap Texas money for Democratic candidates across the nation, and to provide a catch basin and leadership for the 970,000 Texas voters who, in 1952, remained faithful to the National Party. Fragile and, as yet unsure of itself, this council starts with the tremendous resource of the 1952 Loyalist voters and the leadership of some of the oldest Texas family names. Its weaknesses are twofold. It lacks any echo in the press and communications of the state, and it now lacks the funds to overcome this press blackout. Although its leaders will contest the state elections of 54 with a slim chance of winning, its real sights are fixated on 1956 and control of the Texas delegation to the National Convention. At the moment, Governor Shivers, his machine, and its supporting community groups and the oil monies is set the political tone of Texas, which, far more importantly than any formal organization, control its elections and its government. If these elements are politically vulnerable, as this correspondent believes they are vulnerable because the changes that have to strength are producing dynamic counterforces of their own. The wealth that Texas has poured into its great universities and cultural institutions inevitably produces professors who teach and students who think. The most effective protest against Senator McCarthy's address on Texas Independence Day came from students of the University of Texas. Just as important, the great Texas industrial boom has created a growing and powerful, if politically untutored, body of industrial workers. The vigor of the anti-labor crusade and the harsh restriction upon unionism have begun to force organized labor into Texas politics on a northern scale of self-defense. For the first time in the Texas Advisory Council, a body of practical politicians in Texas has begun to organize not apart from or in hostility to labor, but with labor unions and confederations as an integral part of the organization. Beyond these are other factors. There is, to take one, the growing importance of Black and Mexican voters. Black and Mexican citizens together account for 1/4 of the Texan population. In practice, say the hard-boiled politicians, many of these votes can be controlled or cowed in any municipal or local election, but in statewide contests and certainly in national elections, these minority votes can no longer be bought. As Texas goes. These are the perspectives of the contest. To maintain its control, the present Texas leadership must go on from extreme to extreme in an effort to keep the thinking of a modern industrial community bent to the code of the vigilantes. Its efforts are more than local interest. In American politics, certain states periodically acquire an influence, sectional or national, far beyond their geographical limits. Virginia and Massachusetts in the early days of the Republic, Ohio and Pennsylvania in the post-Civil War era enjoyed such power. No one in modern times has been able to ignore the impact of New York, Illinois, Wisconsin, and California on the nation in both leadership and legislation. In the roster of the great and dynamic state of Texas has now won a place. The struggle for control of its bursting energy and industrial power cannot leave American life unchanged. Whichever way it goes, the rest of the nation will be tugged to follow or to resist.
Hello, this is Fiveum, saying thank you for listening, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. If you can, please like and share it around, and if you're feeling especially generous, please subscribe. I need at least 100 subscribers to change my YouTube channel's URL, and my default is long and ugly, and I really don't like it. It would be extremely helpful for me if you subscribed. But you don't have to. I'm not your boss. I'm just